On a night when the Montana winter buried the world in silence so complete you could hear your own heartbeat, farmer Marcus Hayes stumbled upon something that would haunt him forever. A black horse, magnificent and broken, chained to a frozen post in the middle of nowhere, its dark eyes reflecting a terror that went beyond the storm. He thought freeing the animal was an act of basic decency. He had no idea that what he would discover tangled in those chains, hidden beneath years of fear and pain, would shatter everything he thought he understood about cruelty, redemption, and the invisible scars we all carry. What Marcus found that night didn't just save a horse. Saved him too. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The cold had teeth that night. Not the clean, sharp cold of early winter that bites and releases, but the kind that sinks into your bones and stays there, patient and relentless. Marcus Hayes drove his truck down Old Mill Road with both hands gripped tight on the wheel, his headlights carving narrow tunnels through the swirling white. The radio had died 20 minutes back, claimed by static, and now there was only the groan of the engine and the rhythmic thump of wipers losing their battle against the snow. He had left Timber Ridge later than he should have. The meeting at Patterson's Feed Supply had dragged on, the usual talk of spring planting and equipment repairs stretching into something heavier when old Frank Dawson started talking about losing his dairy herd to disease. Marcus had stayed because that's what you did in a town this size. You stayed. You listened. You offered what comfort you could, even when your own reserves ran close to empty. The road curved along Clearwater Creek, though tonight you couldn't see the water through the snow and darkness. Marcus knew these turns by memory, every dip and rise, every place where ice liked to gather. He had driven this route 1,000 times over the past 15 years, ever since he and Grace had bought Ironwood Ranch with dreams bigger than their bank account. Back then, Daniel had been 7 years old, small enough to sit on Marcus's lap and pretend to steer while Grace laughed from the passenger seat. Marcus pushed the memory away before it could settle. The trick was not to let them land, these fragments of the past. Keep moving. Keep the mind occupied with the present, with the immediate demands of frozen pipes and hungry livestock and roads that disappeared under snow. That's when he heard it. At first, he thought the sound was mechanical, some new complaint from the truck's aging transmission. But then it came again, cutting through the storm with a clarity that made his foot ease off the gas. It was organic, alive, a sound that belonged to something with lungs and vocal cords. A cry that started low and rose into something desperate. Marcus pulled the truck to the shoulder, or what he guessed was the shoulder since the road had become indistinguishable from the ditch. He killed the engine and sat for a moment in the sudden quiet, listening. The wind howled around the cab, shaking the frame. Snow piled against the windshield faster than the wipers had cleared it. Every instinct told him to start the engine and keep driving, to get home before the storm made the road impassable. But the sound came again, closer now, raw and pleading. He grabbed his flashlight from the glove box, pulled his wool cap down over his ears, and stepped out into the storm. The cold hit him like a physical force, stealing his breath and making his eyes water instantly. He had to lean into the wind just to stay upright. The beam of his flashlight barely penetrated the swirling snow, illuminating nothing but white chaos. Marcus moved toward the sound, each step sinking ankle-deep into fresh powder. His boots were good, insulated and waterproof, but within minutes he could feel the cold working its way through the leather. The creek was somewhere to his left, the tree line to his right, and between them stretched a field that belonged to the Callahan Ranch, or used to before they sold off parcels to cover medical bills. The cry came again, and this time Marcus's flashlight caught something solid in the darkness, a shape too large and too still to be natural. He approached carefully, his veterinary training kicking in automatically. Never rush toward an injured animal. Never assume you understand what you're dealing with. As he got closer, the shape resolved itself into something that made his chest tighten with anger so sudden and sharp it momentarily pushed back the cold. A horse, a black horse, its coat dulled by snow and ice, stood trembling in the open field. But it wasn't just standing there. It was chained. Marcus moved the flashlight beam slowly, taking in the full picture. Heavy chains, the kind used for logging or towing, wrapped around the horse's front legs. The chains led to a metal post that had been driven deep into the frozen ground. Someone had brought equipment out here. Someone had planned this. The horse's head jerked toward him, ears pinned back, eyes rolling white with panic. Steam burst from its nostrils in rapid clouds. Its entire body shook, though Marcus couldn't tell if it was from cold, fear, or exhaustion. Probably all three. He stopped moving, keeping the flashlight pointed down so it wouldn't shine directly in the horse's eyes. His mind raced through protocols from his years as a veterinarian, before he had walked away from the practice, before he had decided he couldn't handle the weight of other people's animals when he couldn't even handle his own grief. The horse was a stallion, he could see that now. Mature, probably 8 or 9 years old based on the build. Thoroughbred or thoroughbred cross, with the long legs and refined head that spoke of generations of careful breeding. This wasn't some random ranch horse. This animal had value, which made its presence here, chained and abandoned, even more incomprehensible. Marcus took a slow step forward. The horse lunged against the chains, metal shrieking against metal. The sound cut through the storm, desperate and furious. Marcus froze. One good kick from a horse this size could shatter ribs, crush a skull. He had seen it happen, had treated the results in emergency rooms and operating tables. But he had also seen horses die from exposure, had watched hypothermia shut down organ systems one by one, had held the heads of animals as they slipped away, their bodies simply giving up when the cold became too much. He couldn't leave this horse here. Marcus slowly lowered himself into a crouch, making himself smaller, less threatening. He pulled off his right glove and reached into his coat pocket, hoping he still had what he thought he had. His fingers closed around something smooth and round. An apple. He had grabbed it from the bowl on the kitchen counter that morning, part of his routine attempt to eat something resembling a balanced diet. He held the apple out, arm extended, palm up. The wind immediately tried to freeze his exposed hand, but he kept it steady. The horse stared at him, sides heaving, breath coming in ragged bursts. Snow accumulated on its back in a white blanket that would have been beautiful if it wasn't so deadly. Marcus could see ice forming in its mane, weighing down the black strands. Minutes passed. Marcus's hand began to shake from the cold, muscles cramping. His knees ached from the crouch. Snow worked its way down the back of his coat, melting against his skin. But he didn't move. This was the core of animal work, the part that couldn't be taught in veterinary school. Patience. The willingness. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. To be uncomfortable. The understanding that trust couldn't be forced, only offered. The horse took a step forward. The chains rattled, and it flinched at its own movement. But hunger or curiosity or some instinct for survival pushed it forward another step. Its neck extended, nostrils flaring as it caught the scent of the apple through the snow and wind. Marcus didn't breathe, didn't blink, just held steady. The horse's lips, surprisingly soft and delicate, touched his palm. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then teeth closed around the apple and pulled it free. The sound of chewing, loud and deliberate, filled the small space between them. Something in Marcus's chest loosened, just slightly. It wasn't much. It wasn't salvation or solution, but it was contact. It was a beginning. He slowly pulled his hand back and put his glove on before frostbite could take hold. The horse chewed, watching him with marginally less panic in its eyes. Marcus stood carefully, keeping his movements slow and deliberate. He needed to think. The chains were secured with padlocks, industrial grade from what he could see. He had nothing in the truck that would cut through metal like that. Even if he did, approaching the horse's legs with bolt cutters while it was in this state would be suicidal. But leaving it wasn't an option either. Marcus made a decision. He walked back to the truck, each step a negotiation with the deepening snow. Inside the cab, he grabbed everything he thought might help. A coil of rope, an old moving blanket, a thermos of coffee that had long since gone cold but at least wasn't frozen. and another apple from the lunch bag he kept behind the seat. The walk back to the horse felt longer. The storm was intensifying, wind-driven snow now moving horizontally across the field. Visibility had dropped to almost nothing. If he hadn't just made this walk, Marcus wasn't sure he could have found the horse again. But there it was, a dark statue in a white world, still standing, still breathing. Marcus approached more confidently this time. Not rushing but not creeping either. He held out the second apple. The horse's head came up immediately, ears swiveling forward. This time there was less hesitation. The apple disappeared in 3 bites. While the horse ate, Marcus moved carefully to the side, examining the chains more closely. They were wrapped multiple times around the front legs, just above the knees. The metal had already rubbed through the hair, and he could see raw skin beneath. How long had this horse been here? Hours? Days? The snow made it impossible to tell if there were older tracks, any evidence of who had done this. The padlocks were top quality, the kind that would require either a key or serious cutting equipment. But the post itself, while driven deep, was just metal. And metal conducted cold. Marcus reached out slowly and touched it. The horse flinched but didn't bolt. The post was freezing, probably well below 0. In summer, it would have been unmovable. But in this cold, with the ground frozen solid, it might have some give. It was a desperate idea, but desperate was all he had. Marcus went back to the truck one more time. This time he pulled out the tire iron and a small camping shovel from the emergency kit he kept in the bed. When he returned, the horse watched his approach with something that might have been recognition. He didn't have a plan so much as a hope. If he could dig around the base of the post, if he could create enough looseness, maybe he could work it free. It would take time they didn't have, energy he wasn't sure he possessed. But it was something. Marcus started digging. The ground resisted every thrust of the shovel. Frozen earth that might as well have been concrete. But he kept at it, chipping away, using the tire iron to break through the worst of it. Sweat soaked through his thermal layer despite the cold. His shoulders burned. His hands, even in gloves, began to lose feeling. The horse watched him work. At some point, it stopped pulling against the chains. At some point, it lowered its head slightly, as if understanding that this strange human in the storm wasn't another threat, but possibly, improbably, help. Marcus didn't know how long he dug. Time lost meaning in the white chaos. Dig, chip, dig, chip. His world contracted to the small circle of earth around the post, to the next shovelful, the next strike of the iron. And then, finally, the post shifted. Just a fraction of an inch, but it moved. Marcus dropped the shovel and grabbed the post with both hands. He pulled, using his legs, his back, everything he had. The post resisted, then grudgingly gave another inch. The horse, sensing something changing, took a step back. The chains went taut, and for a horrible moment Marcus thought the added tension would hold the post firm. But then something gave. The frozen earth released its grip. The post came free so suddenly that Marcus fell backward into the snow. The metal pole clutched in his hands like a trophy. He lay there for a moment, breathing hard, looking up at the snow falling from a sky he couldn't see. Then he sat up. The horse stood 3 feet away, chains still wrapped around its legs but no longer anchored to anything. Could move now, could run. And that presented an entirely new problem. The storm had a voice that night, a low moan that rose and fell like something alive and wounded. Marcus sat in the snow, the freed post still clutched in his numb hands, and watched the black horse process its newfound mobility. The chains dragged behind it as it took one tentative step, then another, testing the limits of what had changed. Snow had plastered itself against the left side of the animal's body, creating a stark contrast against the dark coat, like someone had painted half of it white. Marcus knew he should stand up, should do something, but exhaustion had seeped into his muscles and turned them to lead. The adrenaline that had fueled the digging was draining away, leaving behind the cold reality of his situation. He was a 52-year-old man who had just spent what felt like hours fighting frozen ground in sub-zero temperatures. His truck was somewhere behind him in the darkness. The road home was becoming more impassable by the minute, and he had a traumatized horse with chains still. wrapped around its legs standing in front of him. The smart thing, the rational thing, would have been to leave, to mark the location somehow, to get himself to safety, and return with help in the morning. That's what the old Marcus would have done, the veterinarian who understood risk assessment and proper protocols. But that Marcus had died 15 years ago on a stretch of highway not far from here. Died when a drunk driver crossed the center line and took Grace and Daniel with him. The Marcus who remained had different calculations, different priorities. He pushed himself to his feet, his joints protesting. The horse's ears swiveled toward him, tracking the movement, but it didn't bolt. That was something. Marcus brushed the snow from his coat and pants, a futile gesture given that more snow was falling to replace what he cleared. The wind had picked up even more in the time he had been digging, and now it carried a razor edge that cut through layers of clothing like they were paper. Timber Ridge sat in a bowl of mountains that usually protected it from the worst of the weather, but when storms came down from Canada they arrived with a vengeance that seemed personal. Marcus had lived through 20 Montana winters, had seen temperatures drop to 40 below, had watched cattle freeze standing up. This storm wasn't the worst he had experienced, but it was working its way up the list. The horse took another step, and the chains scraped across frozen ground with a sound that made Marcus wince. Those chains needed to come off, but that would require tools he didn't have and a level of cooperation from the horse that seemed unlikely. What he needed was to get them both somewhere warm, somewhere with light and proper equipment. The ranch. It was the only option. Ironwood Ranch was maybe 4 miles from here, 4 miles that in good weather would take less than 10 minutes to drive. In this storm, with a traumatized horse, it might as well have been 40. Marcus approached the horse slowly, hands visible, movements telegraphed. The animal tensed but held its ground. Up close, Marcus could see details that his flashlight had missed earlier. This wasn't just any horse. The conformation spoke of serious breeding, the kind of bloodlines that cost real money. The head was refined, almost delicate, with a small star on the forehead barely visible beneath the accumulated snow. The chest was deep, the legs long and elegant despite the chains that marred them. Someone had invested significant resources in this animal. Someone had then driven it out to a field in the middle of nowhere and chained it to a post to die. The contradiction sat in Marcus's mind like a stone, cold and heavy. He pulled the rope from his shoulder, the same rope he had carried from the truck and forgotten in the urgency of digging. It was good rope, the kind ranchers used for everything from leading cattle to emergency repairs on equipment. He had owned this particular coil for almost a decade, had used it to pull Daniel's stuck bicycle from a creek bed, had used it to secure tarps during windstorms, had used it for 100 mundane tasks that accumulate in the life of someone who works the land. Marcus made a loop in one end, not a lasso, nothing aggressive, just a simple circle that could slide over the horse's head if the animal allowed it. He held it out, letting the horse see it, smell it. The black nose extended, nostrils flaring. After a moment of consideration, the horse exhaled sharply, a sound that in other circumstances might have been dismissive. Taking that as consent or at least lack of violent objection, Marcus slowly raised the loop. The horse's head came up sharply, and for a moment Marcus thought he had miscalculated. But then the animal settled, and Marcus was able to slip the loop over its head, letting it rest loosely around the powerful neck. The rope connected them now, a physical link that was both reassuring and terrifying. If the horse decided to run, Marcus would have to let go or be dragged. If the horse decided to fight, the rope could become a weapon. But it also meant guidance, meant the possibility of leading rather than chasing. Marcus gathered up the loose end of the rope and turned toward where he believed his truck waited. The horse resisted for a moment, pulling back against the unfamiliar pressure. Marcus didn't fight it. He simply stood, holding steady tension on the rope, waiting. This was the other half of patience, the understanding that you could offer direction but couldn't force acceptance. The wind shrieked across the field, carrying snow that felt like sand blasting against exposed skin. Marcus's face had gone numb, and he knew without checking that his cheeks and nose were probably approaching frostbite territory. His fingers inside his gloves had lost individual sensation, becoming clubs on the ends of his hands. The horse took a step forward, then another. The chains dragged and rattled, a percussion section to the wind's symphony. Marcus started walking, keeping the tension light, letting the horse choose to follow rather than forcing it. They moved through the storm like ghosts, two dark shapes in a world that had been reduced to varying shades of white and gray. Marcus's flashlight beam bounced uselessly off the snow, creating more confusion than clarity. He navigated by memory and instinct, aiming for where his internal compass said the road should be. His boots disappeared into drifts that were now knee-deep in places. Each step required effort, required lifting his foot high enough to clear the accumulated snow before planting it forward. Behind him, the horse struggled too, its longer legs giving it some advantage but the chains creating drag that slowed every movement. Time became elastic, stretching and compressing. Marcus would later have no idea how long it took them to reach the truck. Could have been 10 minutes or an hour. All he knew was that eventually his flashlight beam caught the reflection of metal, the familiar shape of his Ford's tailgate emerging from the white like a ship materializing from fog. Relief flooded through him, so intense it was almost painful. The truck meant shelter from the wind, meant a heater that might still be able to push out some warmth, meant communication with the outside world through the radio if he could get a signal. But it also meant solving a new problem. How was he going to get a chained horse into the bed of a pickup truck? Marcus led the horse around to the back of the truck, the animal following now with less resistance, as if it too recognized the vehicle as something significant. The tailgate was already down from when he had grabbed the shovel and tire iron earlier. The bed of the truck sat about 3 feet off the ground, a height that wouldn't be a problem for a healthy horse but might be insurmountable for one that was exhausted, injured, and dragging chains. He tied the rope to the tailgate, giving the horse enough slack to move but keeping it connected. Then he climbed into the truck bed himself, his stiff muscles protesting every movement. The bed was coated in a thin layer of snow, and his boots slipped before finding purchase on the textured bed liner. Marcus looked down at the horse, and the horse looked back at him. In the dim light, its eyes were enormous, dark pools that reflected his flashlight beam like mirrors. There was intelligence there. Marcus could see it, intelligence and exhaustion and something else he couldn't quite name. Question, maybe, or a judgment. He didn't have treats this time, had used his only apples in the initial contact. What he had was himself, his voice, his presence. He crouched down, making himself smaller, less threatening. Then he started talking. The words didn't matter much. He talked about the storm, about the ranch, about how much warmer it would be once they got moving. He talked about the barn that waited at Ironwood, old but solid, built by hands that understood Montana winters. He talked about hay and grain and water that wasn't frozen into ice. The horse's ears flicked back and forth, tracking his voice. It took a step closer to the tailgate, then stopped. Marcus kept talking, kept his voice low and steady, a counterpoint to the wind's howl. He had done this before, years ago, talking animals through procedures they didn't understand, using his voice as an anchor in their confusion. The horse took another step. Its front hooves came up to rest on the tailgate, testing the surface. The chains rattled as they dragged up the metal. For a moment, the horse stood like that, half in and half out, as if considering the commitment. Then, with a surge of effort that made Marcus scramble backward, the horse heaved itself up and into the truck bed. The vehicle rocked on its suspension from the sudden weight. The horse's hooves scrabbled for purchase on the slick bed liner before finding stability. They stood there together in the bed of the truck, man and horse, both breathing hard, steam from their breath mixing in the cold air. The truck bed suddenly felt very small. Marcus was acutely aware of how close those hooves were, how a single panicked movement could end very badly for him. But the horse just stood there, sides heaving, head lowered. Exhaustion was overriding fear. That was good and bad. Good because it made the horse manageable. Bad because it spoke to just how close the animal was to its limits. Marcus eased his way past the horse, giving it as much space as the confined area allowed, and jumped down from the tailgate. He untied the rope, leaving it attached to the horse's neck but removing the connection to the truck. Then he pulled the moving blanket from where he had left it earlier and carefully draped it over the horse's back, securing it as best he could. The blanket wasn't much, wasn't nearly enough for this cold. but it was something. It would break the wind, would hold in some of the horse's body heat. It was better than nothing, which seemed to be the theme of the entire night. Marcus closed the tailgate as gently as he could, the metal hinges creaking in protest. The horse shifted nervously at the sound but didn't try to jump out. That was good. The sides of the truck bed were high enough that a jump would be dangerous, potentially leg-breaking, and the horse seemed to understand that on some level. He made his way to the cab, slipping once in the snow and catching himself against the door. His hands were so cold now that opening the door took 3 tries, his fingers refusing to close properly around the handle. When he finally got it open, he pulled himself inside and just sat for a moment in the driver's seat, letting the absence of wind feel like a gift. The truck started on the second try, the engine turning over reluctantly before catching. Marcus let it idle, knowing he should wait for it to warm up before asking it to move. Through the rear window, he could see the dark shape of the horse standing in the bed, the moving blanket a pale blob against its black coat. He turned the heat to maximum and aimed all the vents at himself. The air that came out was barely lukewarm, but it felt like paradise compared to the outside. Slowly, painfully, sensation began returning to his extremities. His fingers tingled, then burned. His toes felt like they were being stabbed with needles. His face throbbed as frozen skin began to thaw. The radio was still static, but Marcus tried it anyway, spinning through channels in hopes of catching something. All he got was white noise interspersed with fragments of sound that might have been voices or might have been artifacts of the storm. No weather report, no emergency broadcasts, just the emptiness of broken signals. He checked his phone. No service. Not surprising, given where they were and the weather conditions. The screen showed 11:47 p.m. Marcus stared at the numbers, trying to reconcile them with his sense of time. It felt like he had been out in the storm for days, but apparently it had been less than 2 hours since he left Patterson's feed supply. The truck's temperature gauge was creeping upward, approaching the normal range. Marcus put it in drive and felt the wheels spin before catching. The truck lurched forward, found traction, and began moving. The headlights illuminated a wall of falling snow that seemed to move toward them rather than the other way around. Old Mill Road was completely buried. Marcus drove by memory and faith, steering where he believed the pavement should be. The truck moved at a crawl, maybe 5 miles per hour, the engine whining in low gear. Every few seconds, Marcus glanced in the rearview mirror, checking on the horse. It stood swaying slightly, the movement of the truck or its own exhaustion making it rock. For miles had never seemed so far. The road climbed slightly, following the contour of the land, and the truck's wheels spun more frequently, requiring careful application of gas to avoid getting stuck. Twice, Marcus felt the back end start to slide, the weight of the horse actually helping keep the rear wheels planted. The landscape was familiar but transformed, every landmark buried or disguised by snow. The big pine that marked the turn onto Cutler's property was a white ghost. The mailbox cluster where 4 ranch roads intersected was completely submerged. Marcus drove on, counting telephone poles when he could see them, using their spacing to estimate distance. The cab had finally warmed up enough that the windshield was clearing, though the wipers still fought a losing battle against the accumulation. Marcus's hands had thawed enough to hurt, a deep ache that ran from his fingertips to his wrists. He flexed them on the wheel, trying to keep blood flowing. His mind wanted to drift, to process what he had done and what he was doing, but he forced it to stay focused on the immediate task. Get home. Get the horse into the barn. Deal with the chains. Everything else could wait. The turnoff to Ironwood Ranch appeared suddenly, marked by the stone pillars that Grace had insisted on installing when they bought the place. She had wanted something permanent, something that would last. Marcus had thought it was extravagant, but he had built them anyway, mortaring stones that they had collected from the property into pillars that now stood like sentinels on either side of the drive. He turned between them, and the truck immediately sank deeper into snow. The driveway was a 1/4 mile long, and the wind had created drifts here that were waist-deep in places. Marcus kept his foot steady on the gas, feeling the truck plow forward, momentum and weight combining to push through obstacles that would have stopped a lighter vehicle. The ranch house appeared first, dark except for the porch light that Marcus left on a timer. It was a simple structure, single story, built in the 1960s and updated haphazardly over the decades. Beyond it, maybe 50 yards farther, the barn rose against the storm, its red paint invisible in the darkness but its shape familiar enough that Marcus could navigate to it blind. He drove past the house, the truck's headlights sweeping across the front yard where a vegetable garden slept under snow, where a tire swing Daniel had used hung motionless from the big oak. Marcus kept his eyes forward, focused on the barn. The barn's main doors faced south, away from the prevailing wind, which meant the area in front of them was relatively clear. Marcus pulled the truck as close as he dared, then killed the engine. The sudden silence was profound, broken only by the muffled howl of wind and the ticking of the cooling engine. He sat for a moment, gathering himself. Then he opened the door and stepped back out into the storm. The barn doors resisted when Marcus tried to open them, frozen shut by ice that had formed in the seams. He threw his shoulder against the wood, once, twice, 3 times before something gave with a crack that echoed across the empty yard. The doors swung inward, revealing darkness that seemed absolute after the reflected brightness of snow everywhere else. Marcus fumbled for the light switch just inside the entrance, his thick gloves making his fingers clumsy. When the overhead lights flickered on, they revealed a space that looked exactly as he had left it that morning, which somehow felt impossible given everything that had happened since. The barn was long and rectangular, built in an era when craftsmanship mattered more than speed. The walls were solid pine, the floor packed earth that had been worn smooth by decades of use. Stalls lined both sides, 6 in total, though only 2 had seen regular use in recent years. The rest stood empty, doors hanging open, revealing spaces filled with stored equipment and forgotten tools. The air smelled of old hay and dust and the faint sweetness of aged wood, a smell that always reminded Marcus of his father, though he had never fully understood why. At the far end, a hayloft stretched across the width of the building, accessible by a wooden ladder that looked less stable than it probably was. Bales of hay were stacked up there, surplus from the previous season that Marcus hadn't yet needed. The sight of them gave him some relief. At least he had food for the horse, assuming he could get the animal inside and calm enough to eat. Marcus left the barn doors open and returned to the truck. The horse stood exactly as it had been, head lowered, the moving blanket still draped across its back. Ice had formed along the edges of the blanket where the horse's breath had condensed and frozen. When Marcus lowered the tailgate, the sound of metal on metal made the horse's head come up sharply, ears pinned back. They looked at each other across the small distance. Marcus could see the calculation happening behind those dark eyes, the horse trying to determine whether this new situation represented safety or a different kind of danger. Trust was such a fragile thing, Marcus thought. So easy to destroy, so difficult to build, and even harder to rebuild once broken. He reached for the rope still attached to the horse's neck, moving slowly, his movements exaggerated so the animal could track every gesture. His fingers closed around the rough fiber, and he applied gentle pressure, not pulling, just suggesting direction. The horse resisted at first, leaning back, the weight of its body acting as an anchor. Marcus waited, maintaining steady tension on the rope, his arm beginning to ache from the sustained effort. The wind had picked up again, blasting snow across the open space between truck and barn. Marcus could barely see the barn doors now, even though they were less than 20 feet away. The storm was entering a new phase, the kind of intensity that turned landscapes deadly. He had maybe an hour before the roads became completely impassable, before anyone else caught out in this would be in serious danger. The thought reminded him that there might be others out there, other animals, other situations that needed intervention. But he couldn't think about that now. He had to focus on what was in front of him. The horse shifted its weight forward, and Marcus felt the change in tension immediately. He took a step backward, maintaining the pressure, and the horse followed. One step, then another, until the horse's front hooves reached the edge of the tailgate. Marcus held his breath. This was the dangerous moment, the transition from truck to ground where a misstep could mean injury. The horse gathered itself and jumped, A controlled drop that brought all four hooves down on the snow-covered ground with a thud Marcus felt through his boots. The chains rattled violently with the impact, and the horse flinched at its own noise. But it was down, it was mobile, and most importantly, it was following Marcus's lead. They walked toward the barn together, the horse limping now, favoring its right front leg. Marcus noticed the limp and felt a spike of concern. He hadn't seen any obvious injury beyond the chafing from the chains, but a horse could hide pain until it became catastrophic. He would need to do a thorough examination once they were inside, once he had proper light and the animal had calmed down enough to allow close inspection. The barn's interior, lit and relatively warm compared to outside, seemed to confuse the horse. It stopped at the threshold, nostrils flaring as it took in the unfamiliar scents. Horses were prey animals, Marcus remembered from his veterinary training, hardwired to be suspicious of enclosed spaces where predators might lurk. Every instinct this animal possessed was probably screaming at it to bolt, to run back into the open despite the storm. Marcus gave the rope more slack, allowing the horse to make its own decision about entering. He positioned himself to the side, not blocking the doorway, making it clear that this was an invitation rather than a trap. His legs trembled with exhaustion, and he realized he had been operating on adrenaline for so long that his body was starting to shut down. He needed rest, needed warmth, needed to process everything that had happened. But first, he needed to get this horse inside. The horse took a tentative step forward, then another. Its hooves clicked against the hard-packed floor, a sound that seemed unnaturally loud in the enclosed space. Marcus walked backward slowly, leading the horse deeper into the barn, past the empty stalls, toward the two at the end that he maintained for the occasional livestock he still kept. One of those stalls held fresh straw from earlier that week when he had been planning to take in a neighbor's horse for a few days. A plan that had fallen through when the neighbor decided to sell the animal instead. The stall door stood open, and Marcus guided the horse inside. The space was generous, maybe 12 feet by 12 feet, with solid walls on 3 sides and metal bars forming the 4th. A window high up on the back wall let in natural light during the day and was shuttered now against the storm. The floor was covered in clean straw, deep enough to provide cushioning and insulation. The horse entered the stall and immediately moved to the far corner, as far from Marcus as the space allowed. It turned to face him, eyes wide, body tense, every line of its posture screaming readiness to fight or flee. Marcus backed out slowly and closed the stall door with a soft click. The horse was contained now, safe from the storm, but still very much a wild card. Marcus leaned against the stall door and allowed himself a moment to simply breathe. His entire body ached. His hands, even inside gloves, felt like they had been beaten with hammers. His face burned where frostbite had touched it. His lungs hurt from breathing cold air. But he had done it. He had found a horse chained in a snowstorm and gotten it to safety. That had to count for something. Except now that the immediate crisis was over, now that the adrenaline was fading, Marcus's mind began to turn over the questions he had been suppressing. Who had chained this horse? Why? How long had it been out there? And perhaps most pressingly, what was he supposed to do now? He needed to call someone, report what he had found. Sheriff Kowalski should be notified. The animal welfare people. Maybe a veterinarian, though the nearest one was Bill Morrison. And the thought of calling his former colleague filled Marcus with a complicated mix of emotions he didn't want to examine. But those were problems for later. Right now, he needed to deal with the chains. Marcus pushed off from the stall door and moved to his workbench. A long table that ran along one wall and was covered with tools in varying states of organization. He found his bolt cutters hanging on a pegboard, large industrial ones he had used for cutting fence wire and other heavy materials. He grabbed them and a pair of wire cutters for good measure, then returned to the stall. The horse watched him approach with renewed suspicion. Marcus opened the stall door just enough to slip inside, then closed it behind him. The space immediately felt smaller with both of them in it. The horse shifted nervously, its hindquarters pressing against the back wall. Marcus held up the bolt cutters, showing them to the horse even though the animal had no way of understanding what they were for. He spoke quietly, continuously, his voice a steady stream of meaningless words meant only to soothe. Then he took a step forward. The horse's head came up sharply, and it snorted, a sharp exhalation that sounded like a warning. Marcus stopped. He needed to get close enough to cut the chains, but not close enough to get kicked. The paradox of the situation would have been funny if it wasn't so dangerous. He tried a different approach. Instead of moving toward the horse's head, he angled toward its shoulder, approaching from the side where its field of vision would keep him in sight but where his body language would appear less threatening. The horse tracked his movement, head turning to follow, but it didn't lunge or kick. Marcus got within arm's reach and slowly extended his hand, palm up, empty of everything except intention. The horse's nostrils flared, taking in his scent. After a long moment, it allowed him to touch its shoulder, just a light contact, his fingers barely pressing against the snow-dampened coat. The horse's skin quivered under his touch, muscles twitching with tension, but it didn't pull away. Marcus took that as permission to continue. He ran his hand down the horse's leg, moving slowly, giving the animal time to adjust to each new contact point. When he reached the chains, he could feel the heat of inflammation in the surrounding tissue. The metal had cut deeper than he had initially thought, abrading not just hair but skin, probably down to the fascia layer beneath. Working by feel as much as sight, Marcus positioned the bolt cutters around one of the chain links. The cutters were heavy, designed for two-handed operation, and trying to use them while crouched next to a nervous horse was awkward at best. He squeezed the handles together, applying as much pressure as he could manage from his uncomfortable position. The chain resisted. These were serious chains, the kind made to hold against substantial force. Marcus's hands were still weak from the cold, and his grip kept slipping on the handles. He reset his position, planted his feet more firmly, and tried again. This time he felt something give, the metal beginning to deform under the pressure. The horse shifted suddenly, startled by the movement or the sound or simply by its own fear. Its leg jerked, pulling away from Marcus's grip, and the bolt cutters clattered to the straw. Marcus froze, waiting to see if the horse would bolt or kick. But after a moment of tense stillness, the animal settled again, though its breathing had accelerated. Marcus retrieved the bolt cutters and started over. This time he worked even more slowly, stopping every few seconds to stroke the horse's leg, to murmur reassurances, to remind the animal that he wasn't an enemy. The process was excruciating in its slowness, each increment of progress measured in fractions of inches. When the first chain link finally gave way with a sharp crack, the sound was so sudden and loud that both Marcus and the horse jumped. The chain fell away from the horse's leg, hitting the ground with a heavy thud. One leg free. 3 more to go. Marcus moved to the other front leg, and the process began again. Position the cutters, squeeze, pause when the horse tensed, stroke and soothe, squeeze again. His hands were cramping now, the muscles in his forearms burning from the repeated effort. Sweat ran down his back despite the cold, soaking through his thermal layers. The second chain gave way more quickly, maybe because Marcus had found the rhythm of it, or maybe because his desperation had given him strength he didn't know he possessed. When it fell, he allowed himself a moment to rest, crouching there in the straw next to the horse, his head bowed, his breath coming in gasps. The back legs were going to be harder, more dangerous. A horse's rear legs carried tremendous power, evolved to deliver kicks that could kill predators or break the bones of rivals. Marcus had seen the results of horse kicks in emergency rooms, had treated fractures that turned bones into jigsaw puzzles. He was acutely aware that he was now within perfect range of that power. But the chains had to come off. Leaving them would mean infection, would mean permanent damage, would mean all of this effort had been for nothing. Marcus shifted his position, moving toward the horse's hindquarters. He kept his body at an angle, never directly behind the animal, always positioned so that a kick would glance off rather than connect squarely. The horse's ears had rotated backward, tracking him, and its tail swished nervously. He placed his hand on the horse's hip, a gentle pressure that said, "I'm here. I'm not a threat. Please don't kill me." The horse's skin twitched under his palm, but it didn't kick. Marcus took that as the best permission he was likely to get and ran his hand down the back leg, moving toward the chain. The chain on this leg was wrapped differently, looped multiple times and secured with 2 separate links. Marcus would need to make 2 cuts to free it. He positioned the bolt cutters on the first link and began to squeeze. His hands were shaking now from exhaustion and cold and residual fear. The handles of the cutters slipped once, twice before he got a solid grip. The horse shifted its weight, and Marcus felt the leg he was holding tense. Every prey instinct the animal possessed must have been firing, telling it that something was touching its leg, something that might be trying to grab it to bring it down. The fact that the horse was allowing this at all spoke to either extreme exhaustion or a deeper intelligence that recognized help when it appeared. The first link snapped, and Marcus immediately moved to the second. His vision was starting to blur at the edges, whether from exhaustion or the beginning of hypothermia he wasn't sure. His body temperature had dropped during the time outside, and even though the barn was warmer than the storm, it wasn't warm enough. He needed to finish this and get inside the house, needed to get out of his wet clothes and into something dry. The second link proved stubborn. Marcus squeezed the bolt cutters until his hands screamed in protest, but the metal refused to give. He repositioned, tried a different angle, squeezed again. Nothing. The horse was getting more agitated too, shifting from foot to foot, its patience wearing thin. Marcus rested for a moment, his forehead pressed against the horse's flank, his arms trembling. He thought about giving up, about leaving this last chain for tomorrow when he was rested and could approach it with fresh strength. But the image of the raw, inflamed skin beneath the metal wouldn't let him quit. Every minute that chain remained was another minute of pain for the animal. He gathered himself, adjusted his grip on the cutters one more time, and put everything he had left into one final squeeze. The metal resisted, then suddenly gave way with a crack that sounded like a gunshot in the enclosed space. The horse bolted forward, startled by the sound, and Marcus fell backward into the straw as the animal surged past him. For a terrifying moment, he thought the horse would crash into the stall door, would injure itself trying to escape. But at the last second it turned, circling the small space, chains finally free from all 4 legs and lying scattered in the straw. Marcus lay there on his back, looking up at the barn's rafters, trying to remember how to make his lungs work properly. The horse circled once more, then stopped, standing in the center of the stall, sides heaving. They looked at each other across the small distance, man and animal, both exhausted, both shaken, both somehow still alive. Slowly, moving like an old man, Marcus pushed himself to his feet. He bent and collected the chains, pulling them out of the stall, removing the physical evidence of what had been done to this animal. The chains were heavier than he expected, solid and cold, and as he carried them out of the stall, he felt the weight of them as more than just metal. They were cruelty made tangible, suffering compressed into steel. He dropped the chains outside the stall with a clatter that seemed to echo through the entire barn. Then he returned to the stall door, standing where the horse could see him clearly. The animal watched him warily, but some of the panic had left its eyes. Marcus reached into a bin near the workbench and pulled out a flake of hay, carrying it back to the stall and tossing it over the door. The hay landed in a pile in the center of the stall. The horse looked at it, then at Marcus, then back at the hay. After a moment, it lowered its head and began to eat, the sound of chewing mixing with the distant howl of the storm. Marcus closed the stall door and made sure it was latched. Then he filled a bucket with water from the tap near the workbench, a tap that ran from a well and had a heater to prevent freezing. He hung the bucket inside the stall, and the horse paused its eating long enough to drink deeply, water dripping from its muzzle when it raised its head. Looking at the horse now, freed from its chains, standing in clean straw with food and water, Marcus felt something shift in his chest. It wasn't quite relief, wasn't quite satisfaction. It was more complex than that, a mixture of emotions he didn't have names for. Purpose, maybe, or responsibility, or perhaps just the simple human need to have done something that mattered. He turned off most of the barn lights, leaving just one on near the stall so the horse wouldn't be in complete darkness. Then he stepped back out into the storm, pulling the barn doors closed behind him and securing them against the wind. The walk from barn to house was only 50 yards, but it felt like miles. His legs didn't want to work properly, and he stumbled twice in the deep snow. The wind had reached a fever pitch, howling across the open ground with a sound that was almost alive. Snow stung his face, and he had to keep his head down, navigating by memory rather than sight. When he finally reached the porch steps, he nearly fell climbing them. His hands were so numb he couldn't feel the railing. The front door resisted opening, swollen by moisture or blocked by snow, and he had to throw his shoulder against it just like he had with the barn doors. The house was dark and cold, barely warmer than outside. Marcus had turned down the heat before leaving that morning, a habit born of economics rather than comfort. Now he cranked the thermostat up and stood shivering in the entryway as the furnace kicked on with a reluctant groan. He pulled off his gloves, his coat, his boots, leaving a trail of snow-covered gear across the floor. His hands were pale, almost gray, and when he held them under the kitchen faucet and turned on warm water, the pain that followed was intense enough to make him gasp. The water felt like fire against his frozen skin, each nerve ending screaming as blood flow returned. Marcus stood at the sink, hands under the stream, watching the water swirl down the drain. His mind was numb, unable to process everything that had happened. He had found a horse. He had brought it home. Those were facts, simple and undeniable. Everything else, all the questions and implications and complications, would have to wait until he had slept. Except sleep felt impossible. His body might have been exhausted, but his mind was racing, replaying the night's events in a loop. The sound of the horse's cry cutting through the storm. The moment when it had accepted the apple from his hand. The weight of the chains as he carried them out of the stall. And underneath all of that, a question that wouldn't go away. Who had done this? Who had taken a valuable horse and chained it in a field to die? Marcus dried his hands on a towel and moved to the living room. He picked up the landline phone, one of the few remaining in the county, and dialed Sheriff Kowalski's direct number. The phone rang once, twice, 5 times before going to voicemail. Marcus left a brief message describing what he had found and where the horse was now, then hung up. He tried Bill Morrison's number next, but got only an automated message saying the veterinary clinic was closed due to weather and would reopen when conditions improved. Marcus left a message there too, shorter this time, just asking Bill to call when he could. With nothing else he could do tonight, Marcus made his way to the bedroom. He didn't bother changing clothes, just fell onto the bed still wearing his thermals and jeans. The room was cold, the furnace not yet having pushed heat this far into the house, but he pulled the quilts over himself and closed his eyes. Sleep came quickly, dragging him down into darkness. But even in dreams, he could hear the chains rattling, could see the horse's eyes reflecting his flashlight beam, could feel the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders like snow accumulating on a roof, beautiful and dangerous and impossible to ignore. Dawn arrived without fanfare, just a gradual lightening of the gray sky that made the world visible again. Marcus woke to silence, the kind of deep quiet that follows major storms when even the wind has exhausted itself. He lay still for a moment, disoriented, his body aching in places he had forgotten existed. Then memory returned in a rush, and he sat up so quickly that his vision darkened at the edges. The horse. He had brought a horse home last night. A horse that had been chained in a field, left to die. Marcus swung his legs off the bed and immediately regretted the movement. Every muscle protested, stiff from cold and exertion. His hands were the worst, swollen and tender, the skin across his knuckles cracked and bleeding in places. He flexed his fingers experimentally and winced at the sharp pain that shot up his forearms. The bedroom window showed him a transformed landscape. Snow had buried everything under a blanket that looked at least 3 feet deep in places, sculpted by wind into drifts that rose even higher. The driveway was invisible, the fence posts marked only by the slight mounds of white where they stood. His truck sat near the barn like a prehistoric creature frozen mid-step, its outlines softened by accumulated snow. The clock on the nightstand showed 8:43, which meant he had slept for maybe 6 hours. It felt both too long and not nearly enough. Marcus pushed himself to his feet, swaying slightly as blood rushed to his head. He shuffled to the bathroom and looked at himself in the mirror. The man staring back looked like he had aged a decade overnight. His face was wind-burned, red patches across his cheeks and nose where frostbite had touched him. His eyes were bloodshot, rimmed with dark circles that spoke of exhaustion deeper than one night's sleep could cure. Gray stubble covered his jaw, and his hair stood up in wild angles where he had slept on it wet. Marcus splashed cold water on his face, the shock of it helping to clear some of the fog from his mind. He brushed his teeth, changed into dry clothes, and made his way to the kitchen. The house had warmed during the night, the furnace working overtime to push back the cold. He started a pot of coffee, the familiar ritual grounding him in normalcy even as his mind churned with questions. While the coffee brewed, he tried the phone again. Still no answer from Sheriff Kowalski, though this time Marcus didn't leave another message. Bill Morrison's clinic remained closed. The local radio station, when Marcus turned it on, was playing emergency broadcasts about road closures and power outages. The storm had hit harder than predicted, dumping record snowfall across the northern part of the state. Interstate 15 was closed from Great Falls to the Canadian border. Most county roads were impassable. Crews were working to clear priority routes, but it would be days before rural areas like Timber Ridge received attention. Marcus poured himself coffee and stood at the kitchen window, looking toward the barn. From this angle, he couldn't see into the building, couldn't tell if the horse was still there or if the entire night had been some fever dream brought on by cold and exhaustion. The rational part of his brain knew the horse was real, knew the chains sitting in his barn were proof of what had happened. But another part, the part that had spent 15 years avoiding emotional connection, wanted desperately for it all to have been imaginary. He drank his coffee too fast, burning his tongue, then pulled on his warmest coat and boots. The walk to the barn required breaking a new path through snow that came up to his knees. Each step took effort, lifting his leg high enough to clear the accumulation before plunging it down again. By the time he reached the barn doors, he was breathing hard and sweating under his layers. The barn was cold but not frozen, the walls providing enough insulation to keep the temperature above freezing. Marcus hit the lights and stood for a moment, letting his eyes adjust. Everything looked exactly as he had left it, tools on the workbench, chains piled near the stall door. And inside the stall, the black horse stood watching him with alert, wary eyes. Relief flooded through Marcus so intensely it made him dizzy. The horse was real. It had survived the night. Whatever happened next, at least that much was true. He approached the stall slowly, making sure the horse could see him coming. In the better light of morning, he could assess the animal more thoroughly. The black coat, now mostly dry, showed quality breeding in every line. The horse was a stallion, probably around 9 years old based on the teeth Marcus could see when it yawned. Its conformation suggested thoroughbred bloodlines, the kind of horse that would cost tens of thousands of dollars if purchased through legitimate channels. But it was the scars that told the real story. Now that the chains were gone, Marcus could see the full extent of the damage. Raw, abraded skin circled. All 4 legs just above the knees and hocks, the flesh angry red and weeping in places. Older scars crisscrossed the horse's shoulders and flanks, some of them healed into white lines that stood out against the black coat. These weren't the normal marks of a horse that had tangled with barbed wire or rough terrain. These were deliberate, the result of sustained abuse. Marcus felt anger rising again, hot and sharp. Someone had done this. Someone had taken this magnificent animal and systematically broken it down through pain and fear. And then, when they were done with whatever sick purpose they had in mind, they had chained it in a field and left it to freeze. The question was why? What could possibly motivate someone to treat an animal this way? And more pressingly, what was Marcus supposed to do about it? He fetched the first aid kit from his workbench, a large plastic container filled with supplies left over from his veterinary days. Antibiotic ointment, gauze, medical tape, syringes, bottles of medication that he probably shouldn't still have but couldn't bring himself to throw away. He also grabbed a bucket of warm water and clean rags. The horse watched these preparations with suspicion, ears flicking back and forth. When Marcus entered the stall, the animal retreated to the far corner, as far from him as the space allowed. Marcus didn't push. He set down his supplies and simply stood, waiting, letting the horse adjust to his presence. Minutes passed. Marcus's legs began to ache from standing still, his back complaining about the position. But he had learned patience in the years since leaving his practice, learned it from long nights alone in an empty house, from mornings when getting out of bed required conscious decision rather than automatic habit. Patience was just another form of endurance, and endurance was something Marcus understood. The horse took a tentative step forward. Then another. Its nostrils flared, taking in Marcus's scent, trying to determine whether he represented danger. Marcus remained motionless, barely breathing, presenting himself as the least threatening thing possible. Finally, after what felt like hours but was probably only 10 minutes, the horse was close enough for Marcus to touch. He moved slowly, extending his hand palm up, offering rather than taking. The horse's nose touched his palm, warm breath huffing against his skin. Marcus took that as permission and gently placed his hand on the horse's neck. The coat was coarse under his fingers, dried sweat and dirt matting the hair. The horse trembled at his touch but didn't pull away. Marcus stroked slowly, rhythmically, letting the motion soothe them both. When he felt the animal relax fractionally, he picked up a rag and dipped it in warm water. Cleaning the wounds was painstaking work. The horse flinched every time Marcus touched the raw skin, muscles tensing, but it didn't kick or bolt. Marcus talked constantly as he worked, his voice low and steady, the words meaningless but the tone carrying reassurance. He cleaned each leg methodically, washing away dried blood and debris, revealing the full extent of the damage. The front legs were worse than the back ones. The chains had cut deeper there, probably because the horse had fought harder with its front end, trying to pull free. In several places, Marcus could see exposed tissue, raw meat that should have been protected by skin. These wounds would take weeks to heal properly, and there was serious risk of infection. He applied antibiotic ointment liberally, using his fingers to work it into the damaged tissue. The horse's skin twitched under his touch, but it stood still, as if understanding that this pain was different from the pain that had created the wounds. When Marcus had treated all 4 legs, he wrapped them in gauze, securing the bandages with medical tape that he hoped would hold despite the horse's movement. The work took over an hour. When Marcus finally stepped back to survey his handiwork, he felt a grim satisfaction. The bandages were neat, professional, the kind of work he had done hundreds of times in his practice. His hands remembered the motions even if his heart had tried to forget. He provided fresh hay and water, then left the stall to give the horse space. His next task was less pleasant but necessary. He pulled on heavy gloves and picked up the chains from where he had dropped them the night before. In daylight, they looked even more sinister, the metal dark with rust and what might have been dried blood. Marcus carried them to his truck, brushing off enough snow to open the bed, and threw them inside. Evidence. That's what these were. Evidence of a crime. Back in the house, Marcus tried the phone again. This time, Sheriff Kowalski answered on the 3rd ring, her voice rough with exhaustion. "Marcus Hayes," she said before he could speak. "Got your message from last night. Hell of a storm we had." Marcus told her the full story, starting with hearing the cry from the road and ending with the chains now sitting in his truck bed. Kowalski listened without interrupting, a skill that Marcus appreciated. When he finished, there was a long silence. "You're sure someone chained it deliberately?" she finally said. "Not some accident with equipment or fencing." Marcus thought of the padlocks, of the way the chains had been wrapped methodically around each leg, of the post driven deep into frozen ground. There was no ambiguity here. "I'm sure," he said. "This was intentional." Another silence. Then Kowalski sighed, a sound that carried the weight of too many problems and not enough solutions. "Roads won't be clear for at least 2 days," she said. "Maybe longer for the rural routes. I can't get out to your place until then. Meanwhile, you keep that horse secure and safe. Don't let anyone know you have it except people you trust absolutely. If someone did this deliberately, they might come looking." Marcus felt something cold settle in his stomach that had nothing to do with the temperature. "You think they'll come here?" he said. "I think people who chain animals in fields to die aren't the type to give up easily," Kowalski replied. "Especially if that horse is valuable." Which, from your description, it sounds like it is. You have your shotgun handy? Marcus glanced at the gun cabinet in the corner of his living room. He hadn't opened it in years, hadn't fired a weapon since before Grace and Daniel died. The thought of needing it now made him feel sick. Yeah, he said. I have it. Good. Keep it close. I'll get out there as soon as I can. Meanwhile, I'll make some calls. See if anyone's reported a missing horse matching that description. You got a way to send me photos? Marcus didn't own a smartphone, but he had an old digital camera somewhere. He told Kowalski he would figure something out and ended the call feeling more unsettled than before he had made it. The rest of the morning passed in a blur of activity. Marcus photographed the horse from every angle, the wounds, the scars, even the chains. He would need to drive into town to use the libraries, computer and internet to send the photos, but that would have to wait until the roads cleared. He mucked out the stall, replacing soiled straw with fresh. He checked on the horse's food and water consumption, pleased to see that both had been touched. A horse that ate and drank was a horse that wanted to live. Around noon, Marcus heard an engine outside. His first thought was panic, Kowalski's warning about dangerous people still fresh in his mind. But when he looked out the window, he saw a familiar truck, an old Ford painted in fading blue, making its way slowly up the driveway. Bill Morrison. Marcus met him at the door. Bill was older than Marcus by a decade, somewhere in his mid-60s, with a weathered face and hands that had delivered countless foals and stitched up innumerable injuries. He had been Marcus's mentor during veterinary school, had been the one to help Marcus set up his practice, and had been there at the funeral when Marcus buried his family. Heard you had some excitement last night, Bill said without preamble. Figured I'd drive out once the main roads cleared enough. Took me 2 hours to get here from town. Marcus should have been surprised that Bill knew already, but this was Timber Ridge. Information traveled through informal networks that were faster than any technology. Someone at the sheriff's office had probably mentioned it to someone else, and the story had spread from there. He led Bill to the barn and showed him the horse. Bill's expression didn't change as he took in the animal, the bandages, the visible scars. He had seen enough animal abuse over his career that he had probably developed immunity to the emotional impact. But Marcus noticed the way his jaw tightened, the way his hands clenched briefly before relaxing. Well, Bill said after a long moment someone went to a lot of effort to be cruel. He entered the stall with confidence born of decades of experience, and the horse, perhaps sensing that this human was different from most, allowed him to approach. Bill examined each leg carefully, checking Marcus's bandages, probing gently at the wounds. He looked at the old scars, ran his hands over the horse's body checking for other injuries, studied the animal's teeth and eyes. When he stepped out of the stall, his expression was grim. Whoever owned this horse before put a lot of money into breeding, he said. This is quality stock, probably worth 40 or 50,000 if it's trained. Maybe more if it has a racing record. The scars tell me it's been abused for a while, months at least. Some of these marks are fully healed, which means they're old. The chain wounds are fresh, probably just from last night, but everything else suggests systematic mistreatment. Marcus absorbed this information, adding it to the growing picture in his mind. So someone bought an expensive horse and then tortured it, he said. That doesn't make sense. Bill shook his head. Doesn't have to make sense to us. Could be someone bought it with good intentions and then got frustrated when it didn't perform how they wanted. Could be someone stole it and the abuse came later. Could be a lot of things. People do terrible things to animals for all kinds of reasons, most of them bad. He pulled out a pad and scribbled something, then handed the paper to Marcus. It was a list of medications and dosages. You'll want to get these into it, Bill said. Antibiotics to prevent infection, anti-inflammatory for the swelling. I've got most of this in my truck. Consider it a gift. You're going to need to change those bandages every day. Keep the wounds clean. If you see any sign of infection, swelling, heat, discharge, call me immediately. This horse is lucky you found it. Another few hours in that storm and it would have been dead. Marcus took the paper, his throat tight. He hadn't expected help, hadn't asked for it, but here it was anyway. Why are you doing this? He asked quietly. Bill looked at him, and something in his expression softened. "Because you called," he said simply. "Because you found an animal in trouble and instead of walking away, you did something about it. That matters, Marcus. I know you walked away from veterinary work for your own reasons, and I respect that. But this," he gestured toward the stall, "this is what you trained for. This is what you're good at. Don't waste that." The words hit harder than Marcus expected. He had spent 15 years trying to forget his training, trying to bury the part of himself that knew how to heal. He had told himself that he couldn't handle the responsibility, couldn't face the inevitable losses that came with caring for living things. But standing here in his barn with a rescued horse behind him, he felt something stirring that he had thought was long dead. Bill went to his truck and returned with a box of medical supplies. They spent the next hour going over treatment protocols, discussing nutrition and care strategies. Bill showed Marcus how to check for signs of founder, a potential complication from the stress and cold exposure. He explained how to monitor the horse's temperature and what symptoms would indicate serious problems. Before he left, Bill paused at his truck door. "One more thing," he said. "Someone's going to come asking about this horse. When they do, you make sure you know who you're dealing with before you let them near it. Not everyone who claims ownership actually deserves it." Marcus nodded, the cold weight in his stomach returning. He watched Bill's truck navigate back down the driveway, carving fresh tracks through the snow, and then he was alone again with the horse and his thoughts. The afternoon stretched long and quiet. Marcus checked on the horse every hour, bringing fresh water, replacing hay, adjusting blankets he had hung over the stall to provide extra warmth. The horse tolerated his presence now, no longer retreating to the corner every time he entered. It even allowed him to stroke its neck while it ate, a level of trust that felt both precious and fragile. As evening approached, Marcus found himself sitting on a hay bale outside the stall, just watching the horse. The animal's eyes were closed, head lowered in rest, one back leg cocked in the relaxed posture of a horse that felt safe enough to doze. The sight created an ache in Marcus's chest that he couldn't quite name. He thought about Bill's words about not wasting what he was good at. For 15 years, he had defined himself by what he had lost, by the hole that Grace and Daniel's deaths had carved in his life. He had become a farmer because farming didn't require emotional investment, didn't demand that he care beyond the practical necessities of keeping animals alive long enough to sell. But this horse wasn't just livestock. It was an individual, a creature with its own history of suffering and survival. Saving it wasn't a transaction. It was something else entirely, something that required the parts of himself he had tried to kill. Marcus stood and walked to the stall door. The horse opened its eyes, ears swiveling toward him. They looked at each other across the small distance, and Marcus made a decision. "I'm going to find out who did this to you," he said quietly, "and I'm going to make sure they can't do it again." The horse didn't respond, of course. Animals didn't understand human promises or human determination. But as Marcus turned to leave the barn, as he walked back through the snow toward his house, he felt something that had been absent for a very long time. Purpose. The sun was setting now, painting the snow in shades of pink and gold that would have been beautiful if Marcus had been in a state of mind to appreciate beauty. He stood on his porch and looked out across his land, at the barn where a rescued horse stood in clean straw, at the driveway where tracks from Bill's truck were already beginning to fill with drifting snow, at the vast Montana sky that stretched overhead in endless indifference. Somewhere out there was a person who had chained a horse in a field. Someone who had driven stakes into frozen ground and wrapped heavy chains around living legs and walked away. Someone who might, even now, be planning to reclaim what they saw as their property. Marcus went inside and opened the gun cabinet. The shotgun was exactly where he had left it years ago, cleaned and maintained by habit even though he never used it. He checked that it was loaded, that the mechanism worked, then set it beside the door where it would be within easy reach. Tomorrow the sheriff would come. Tomorrow he would start asking questions in town, would begin the investigation that would hopefully lead to answers. Tomorrow he would figure out the next steps, the practical considerations of keeping and caring for a horse that wasn't technically his. But tonight, all he could do was wait and watch and make sure that nothing happened to the animal he had pulled from the storm. He made himself dinner without tasting it, checked on the horse twice more before dark, and finally settled into his chair by the window with a blanket and a thermos of coffee. He didn't plan to sleep. Kowalski's warning echoed in his mind, and he found himself listening to every sound, every shift of wind or creak of settling snow. The night stretched long and dark, and Marcus watched it pass. A lonely sentinel keeping guard over something fragile and valuable and worth protecting. The storm had passed, but Marcus knew that another kind of storm was just beginning. Questions without answers, dangers without clear shapes, complications that would unfold in ways he couldn't predict. But for the first time in 15 years, Marcus felt ready to face what came next. Because that horse in his barn, that broken and abused and somehow still surviving animal, had given him something he desperately needed. Not comfort, not companionship, but something more fundamental. A reason to care. Morning came with crystalline clarity, the kind of brilliant winter day that follows major storms when the air is so clean it seems you can see for hundreds of miles. Marcus woke in his chair by the window, neck stiff from the awkward angle, blanket pooled around his waist. Sunlight streamed through the glass, almost painful in its intensity as it reflected off the endless expanse of white outside. He stood slowly, joints popping, and looked toward the barn. Everything appeared peaceful, undisturbed. No tracks marred the snow except the ones he and Bill had made yesterday. If anyone had come during the night, they had left no evidence. Marcus allowed himself a small measure of relief, though he knew one quiet night proved nothing. The thermometer outside the kitchen window read 12 degrees, positively balmy compared to the conditions 2 nights ago. Marcus made coffee and toast, forcing himself to eat even though his stomach felt tight with anxiety. He needed to maintain his strength, needed to be ready for whatever came next. When he made his way to the barn, the horse was standing alert near the stall door, as if it had been waiting for him. The bandages on its legs were still in place, no visible bleeding or discharge. That was good. Marcus had half expected to find the wrappings shredded, the wounds reopened by the horse's movement during the night. He entered the stall with Bill's box of medications, moving with the slow confidence that came from a night of keeping watch, of choosing to be responsible for this animal's well-being. The horse watched him approach but didn't retreat. Progress, Marcus thought. Small but significant. Getting medications into a horse that didn't trust humans was always challenging. Marcus remembered techniques from his veterinary days, ways to mask pills and treats, to make injections quick and relatively painless. He started with the oral antibiotics, crushing them and mixing the powder into a handful of grain sweetened with molasses. The horse sniffed the mixture suspiciously, nostrils flaring, then carefully lipped up a small amount. Marcus held his breath. If the horse rejected the medicated grain, he would have to find another approach, one that might involve more force and would certainly damage the fragile trust they were building. But after a moment of consideration, the horse ate the rest of the grain, licking the bucket clean with its long tongue. The anti-inflammatory injection was trickier. Marcus prepared the syringe, drawing the clear liquid from the vial with hands that were steadier than he expected. Muscle memory taking over, his body remembering what his mind had tried to forget. He approached the horse's neck, speaking in low, continuous tones, explaining what he was about to do even though the words meant nothing to the animal. The horse's skin twitched when the needle went in, muscles tensing, but it didn't pull away or strike out. Marcus depressed the plunger slowly, minimizing discomfort, then withdrew the needle and applied pressure to the injection site. The whole process took maybe 30 seconds, but those 30 seconds felt monumental. They represented trust given and not betrayed, vulnerability accepted and protected. Marcus stroked the horse's neck, feeling the powerful muscles beneath the coarse hair, and something loosened in his chest. This feeling, this connection between human and animal, based on nothing but care and consistency, was what had drawn him to veterinary medicine in the first place. He had forgotten how profound it could be. The morning routine established itself naturally. Marcus changed the bandages, pleased to see that the wounds looked slightly better, less angry, the inflammation beginning to subside. He mucked out the stall, replacing soiled straw with fresh. He provided hay and water, checking temperatures and consistency. The work was physical, mindless in the best way, giving his hands something to do while his mind processed everything that had happened. Around mid-morning, Marcus heard another vehicle approaching. His hand moved instinctively toward where the shotgun leaned against the barn wall, but then he recognized the sound of the engine. Sheriff Kowalski's official vehicle, a heavy-duty SUV equipped for rural patrol, came grinding up the driveway with chains on its tires. Kowalski emerged from the vehicle looking exactly as Marcus remembered her, tall and solid, with short gray hair and a face that had seen too much to be surprised by anything. She wore her uniform under a thick winter coat, and her boots were the serious kind meant for real work in bad conditions. "Marcus Hayes," she said, extending a gloved hand. "Been a while since we talked face to face." Marcus shook her hand, feeling the strength in her grip. The last time they had spoken in person was at Daniel's funeral, where Kowalski had stood in her dress uniform among the mourners, representing the law enforcement community even though she hadn't known the family personally. "Show me what you found," she said without preamble. Kowalski wasn't one for small talk, which Marcus appreciated. He led her to the barn and the stall where the horse stood. Kowalski studied the animal with the practiced eye of someone who had investigated enough cases to know what she was looking at. She examined the scars visible on the horse's body, the fresh bandages on its legs, the general condition of the animal. Then Marcus showed her the chains. He had left them in the truck bed, and they lay there like accusations, dark metal against white snow. Kowalski pulled out her phone and photographed them from multiple angles, then slipped on latex gloves and examined them more closely. "These are logging chains," she said. "Heavy duty, probably rated for several £1,000s. Padlocks are master brand, high security. Someone spent money on this setup." She looked at Marcus. This wasn't impulsive. This was planned. Marcus felt the anger returning, that hot rush of fury at deliberate cruelty. "Who would do this?" he asked, though he knew Kowalski had no answer. She pulled off the gloves and tucked them away. "That's what we're going to find out. I've made some calls, checked with registries and breed associations. No one's reported a missing horse matching this description, which tells me either the owners don't want it found, or this animal was never registered in the first place. Given the quality, I'm betting on the former." She pulled out a small notebook, the kind detectives used in movies, though Marcus knew Kowalski used it because she didn't trust technology to work in rural Montana's spotty coverage areas. "Tell me again about finding it," she said. "Every detail you can remember." Marcus walked her through it, starting from hearing the sound that cut through the storm, describing the location along Old Mill Road, the condition of the horse, the process of freeing it and bringing it home. Kowalski took notes in shorthand, occasionally asking clarifying questions. When he finished, she tapped her pen against the notebook. "That stretch of road runs through Callahan property, mostly. But the Callahans sold off parcels over the past few years. I'll need to check records, see who owns that specific section now. Could be the owner, could be someone who just picked a random spot. Hard to say." She closed the notebook and looked toward the horse. "I'm going to have to document this officially. Photos, measurements, full description. Then I'll need to take possession of the chains as evidence. You okay with keeping the horse here for now? Technically, it's evidence too, but there's no facility in the county set up for housing large animals in cases like this." Marcus nodded. He hadn't thought about the possibility of the horse being taken away, but now that Kowalski mentioned it, he realized how much he wanted it to stay. Not forever necessarily, though the thought of forever didn't seem as frightening as it should have. But at least until this was resolved, until they found out who had done this and ensured it couldn't happen again. Kowalski spent the next hour documenting everything. She photographed the horse from every angle, including close-ups of each scar and wound. She measured the horse's height, estimated its weight, noted distinguishing marks like the small star on its forehead. She examined the stall, the barn, even the area where Marcus had first found the animal, though the snow had long since covered any tracks or evidence that might have been there. When she finally packed up her equipment, she seemed satisfied but not optimistic. "This is going to take time," she said. "I'll put out inquiries to neighboring counties, check with vets and farriers, see if anyone recognizes this horse or has treated it. But Marcus, you need to understand something. Even if we find who did this, proving it enough for prosecution is going to be hard. Animal cruelty cases rarely get the attention or resources they deserve. Marcus absorbed this, another piece of the complicated reality he was stepping into. So they might get away with it, he said. Kowalski's expression hardened. Not if I can help it. But you should be prepared for the possibility. Meanwhile, you keep doing what you're doing. Keep the horse healthy. Keep records of all your expenses and treatment. If this goes to court, we'll need documentation of the care required because of the abuse. She climbed into her SUV, the chains now secured in evidence bags in her back seat. Before she closed the door, she looked at Marcus one more time. You did a good thing finding this horse, she said. But be careful. Good things can attract bad attention. You see anyone suspicious, anyone asking questions, you call me immediately. Don't try to handle it yourself. Marcus promised he would, then watched her vehicle disappear down the driveway, tracks already beginning to fill with wind-blown snow. The warning settled over him like a weight, but it didn't change his mind about anything. If bad attention came, he would deal with it. But he wasn't giving up this horse. Back in the barn, Marcus found himself simply sitting with the animal, perched on a hay bale outside the stall, watching the way afternoon light slanted through the high windows and painted gold stripes across the black coat. The horse dozed, one back leg cocked, occasionally shifting weight or flicking its tail at some imagined irritation. It was peaceful in a way Marcus hadn't experienced in years. Not empty peaceful, the kind of quiet that came from isolation and avoidance. This was full peaceful, the kind that came from purpose and presence. The barn felt alive with the horse in it, felt like it meant something again. Marcus thought about names. The horse needed one, something better than the black horse or it. But naming felt presumptuous, felt like claiming ownership he wasn't sure he had any right to. Still, there needed to be something to call this animal, some word that would distinguish it from every other horse in the world. He thought about the circumstances of their meeting, the storm, the darkness, the moment when he had almost driven past but had heard that cry cutting through the wind. The horse had called out, and he had answered. There was something in that, something about voices in darkness, about connection made across impossible distances. Midnight, he said aloud, testing the sound. The horse's ear swiveled toward him, and one eye opened, dark and liquid and infinitely deep. Midnight, Marcus said again, more firmly this time, because that's when I found you. In the middle of the night, in the middle of a storm, in the middle of nowhere. The name settled into place with the rightness of things that couldn't be explained, only recognized. Midnight. It fit the black coat, the dark circumstances, the sense of something precious pulled from the edge of loss. Marcus stood and approached the stall. Midnight watched him come, alert now, tracking his movement. Marcus extended his hand, palm up, empty except for the possibility of touch. The horse considered for a long moment, then stretched its neck forward and pressed its soft nose into Marcus's palm. The contact sent electricity up Marcus's arm. Warm breath, living flesh, a gesture of acceptance that felt like forgiveness for something Marcus hadn't known he needed forgiven. He held perfectly still, not wanting to break the moment, letting it stretch and expand until it filled the barn, filled the space between them. Then Midnight pulled back, lowered its head, and returned to dozing. But something had shifted, some barrier had thinned. They weren't strangers anymore, Marcus and this horse. They were something else, something that didn't have a name yet but might, given time. The rest of the day passed in quiet routine. Marcus checked on Midnight every few hours, administered the evening medications, provided fresh water and hay. He repaired a broken board in one of the other stalls, fixed a hinge on the barn door that had been squeaking for months, organized tools that had accumulated in piles over years of neglect. The work felt good, felt purposeful. He was preparing the barn not just for temporary housing of a rescued animal, but for something longer term. The realization should have scared him, should have triggered all his carefully maintained defenses against attachment. But instead, it felt like relief. As evening approached, Marcus heard yet another vehicle. This time, when he looked out, he saw a truck he didn't recognize, an older Dodge painted in primer gray. His hand moved toward the shotgun, Kowalski's warnings fresh in his mind. But then the driver's door opened, and a teenage girl climbed out. She was maybe 14 or 15, wearing a canvas coat too big for her and carrying a sketch pad under her arm. Dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, eyes that held both nervousness and determination. She stopped when she saw Marcus in the barn doorway, and for a moment they just looked at each other across the snow. "Mr. Hayes," she called out. "I'm Emma Pritchard. I live about 3 miles down the valley. My dad works at Patterson's Feed Supply." Marcus knew Patterson's, knew most of the people who worked there by sight if not by name. He waited for Emma to continue, letting her take the lead in whatever this was. "I heard you found a horse," she said, "during the storm. Is that true?" Word had spread fast, Marcus realized. Though in a town the size of Timber Ridge, anything out of the ordinary was news by nightfall. "It's true," he said carefully. Emma took a few steps closer, and Marcus could see excitement warring with uncertainty in her expression. "Can I see it? Please? I won't bother you or anything. I love horses. I've been drawing them since I was little." She held up the sketch pad as if that explained everything. Marcus should have said no. Should have sent her away, maintained the privacy and security that Kowalski had emphasized. But something in Emma's earnest face reminded him of Daniel at that age, all passion and enthusiasm, hungry for connection with the world. He nodded toward the barn. 5 minutes, he said, "and you don't touch anything without asking." Emma's face lit up with a smile that could have powered the sun. She hurried toward the barn, moving with the awkward energy of adolescence, all long limbs and uncoordinated grace. Marcus followed, wondering if he was making a mistake but unable to bring himself to care. Inside, Emma stopped dead when she saw Midnight. Her mouth opened in a silent "oh," and she stood frozen, taking in every detail. The horse, for its part, seemed more curious than alarmed by this new visitor. Its ears pricked forward, head raised, studying Emma with the same intensity she studied it. "He's beautiful," Emma whispered. "What happened to his legs?" Marcus gave her an abbreviated version, leaving out the worst details but making it clear the horse had been abused. Emma's expression darkened, anger replacing wonder. "Who would do that?" she asked, echoing Marcus's own question. "That's what we're trying to find out," Marcus said. Emma moved closer to the stall, moving with surprising awareness for someone her age, keeping her movements slow and non-threatening. Midnight watched but didn't retreat. Emma stopped at the stall door and simply stood there, not reaching out, just being present. "What's his name?" she asked. "Midnight," Marcus said, and saying it aloud to another person made it feel more real, more official. Emma nodded as if she had expected exactly that name. She opened her sketch pad to a blank page and pulled a pencil from her coat pocket. Then, right there in the barn with cold seeping through the walls and failing light making everything dim, she began to draw. Marcus watched over her shoulder as Midnight took shape on the page. Emma's hand moved with confidence, laying down lines that captured not just the horse's physical form but something of its presence, its essence. The way it held its head, the alert intelligence in its eyes, the power contained in its frame. She drew for maybe 10 minutes, completely absorbed, the world narrowing to nothing but pencil and paper and subject. When she finally looked up, the sketch was remarkable. Not photorealistic, but somehow more true than a photograph would have been. Emma had captured something Marcus hadn't been able to articulate, something about survival and dignity and strength that persisted despite everything that had been done to this animal. "Can I come back?" Emma asked. "Not every day or anything, just sometimes, to draw him. And maybe, if you need help with anything, I could do that too. I'm good at mucking stalls and I don't mind hard work." Marcus knew he should say no, knew that getting a teenager involved was complicated, was opening himself up to questions and interactions and the kind of social engagement he had avoided for 15 years. But looking at Emma's hopeful face, at the sketch she had created, he found himself nodding. "Twice a week," he said. "After school if the roads are clear. You help with chores, you can spend time with Midnight. But you follow my rules about safety, and if I say you need to leave, you leave. No arguments." Emma nodded so vigorously her ponytail bounced. "Deal," she said. "Thank you, Mr. Hayes. You won't regret this." She left a few minutes later, sketch pad clutched to her chest, practically vibrating with excitement. Marcus watched her truck navigate carefully down the driveway, then returned to Midnight's stall. I think I just made things more complicated, he told the horse. Midnight snorted, a sound that might have been agreement or might have just been a horse clearing its nose. That night, Marcus sat at his kitchen table with the sketch Emma had torn from her pad and given him before leaving. She had signed it in the corner, Emma Pritchard, with the date below. He studied the lines, the way she had captured something essential about Midnight, and realized that maybe complicated wasn't the same as wrong. His phone rang, startling him. Bill Morrison's voice came through when Marcus answered. Just checking in, Bill said. How's your patient doing? Marcus updated him on Midnight's condition, the improved appearance of the wounds, the successful medication administration, the way the horse was eating and drinking normally. Good, Bill said. That's real good, Marcus. You're doing this right. And he paused, then continued in a different tone. I heard you let the Pritchard girl visit. Emma. News really did travel fast. Yeah, Marcus said. She wants to draw the horse. Seemed harmless enough. Emma's a good kid, Bill said. Lost her mother a few years back to cancer. Her dad does his best, but she could use positive influences. You might find she helps more than she complicates things. After they hung up, Marcus sat in the dark kitchen thinking about Emma, about loss, about how people carried grief in different ways. Emma channeled hers into art, into drawings that captured beauty and meaning. Daniel had been like that too, always creating, always finding wonder in ordinary things. Marcus had channeled his grief into isolation, into emotional shutdown. But maybe, just maybe, there were other options. Maybe healing didn't have to mean forgetting or avoiding. Maybe it could mean opening up again carefully to the possibility of connection. He looked at Emma's sketch of Midnight one more time, then stood and carried it to the refrigerator. He pinned it there with a magnet shaped like a horseshoe, something Grace had bought years ago because she thought it was cute. The sketch looked right there, looked like it belonged. Before bed, Marcus made one more check on Midnight. The horse was lying down in the straw, legs tucked beneath it, dozing in the complete relaxation of an animal that felt safe. Marcus stood at the stall door for a long time, just watching the rise and fall of Midnight's breathing, the occasional twitch of ears, the peaceful presence of another living being. You're changing things, Marcus said quietly. Changing me, I think. Not sure yet if that's good or bad. Midnight's eye opened, reflecting the dim light like a mirror. They looked at each other across the stall, across the distance between species, across the impossible gap between trauma and trust. Then Midnight's eye closed again, and the horse returned to its rest, and Marcus walked back through the snow to his house feeling something he hadn't felt in a very long time. Hope. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.